My wife wanted to transfer all my property to herself through blackmail, but I sued her. It was a warm spring night in Los Angeles, the kind of night where even the breeze feels like it's carrying secrets. I was in town visiting an old college buddy who had just landed a big directing gig. He was throwing this house party in the hills, lots of actors, producers, tech types. I'm not really the party kind anymore, but I figured why not? I needed a break from my nonstop coding grind back in Seattle. I'm Jason, by the way, 34 years old, software engineer, doing pretty well for myself. I wasn't there to network or flirt. I just wanted to drink something that wasn't an energy drink and maybe talk to someone about something other than startup funding or agile sprints. The moment I noticed Alice, she was standing in the corner of the kitchen, laughing with a group of people I didn't recognize. She was holding a pie, an actual homemade pie. At a party like that, where people were nibbling at charcuterie boards and sipping cocktails, she'd brought a damn pie. That immediately got my attention. I'm not one of those guys who falls head over heels over aesthetics, but there was something about her. Maybe it was the way she looked like she belonged there and didn't at the same time. Confident, but not loud. So I walked up and made some dumb joke like, "Did you bake that or just swing by a Whole Foods on the way?" Expecting a polite smile or maybe a shrug. But she grinned, handed me a plate, and said, "You tell me." It was cherry, homemade crust. Not too sweet, perfectly tart. I ended up eating 2 slices while we talked at the kitchen island. I found out she was 32, originally from Sacramento, worked in design, freelance, mostly web and branding. Lived in LA with her sister for the past couple of years. We didn't talk about work too much, though. Somehow we got into this deep conversation about why people are so obsessed with true crime podcasts. Don't ask me how we got there, but that was the moment I realized I liked her. After the party, we exchanged numbers. I flew back to Seattle, and I didn't expect much, honestly. I'd done the long-distance thing before, and it never really worked out. But she texted the next morning. Just a photo of the leftover pie with the caption, "Still thinking about that second slice?" We started talking every day. Morning good mornings, late-night conversations about everything from our childhoods to whether aliens would be capitalists. After a month of that, I flew down again. Then again 2 weeks later. Then she came up to visit me. That summer was a blur of airports and FaceTime calls and inside jokes. I couldn't believe how easy it all felt. By the fall, I wasn't just in love, I was all in. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to perform or measure up to anything. With Alice, I could just be. We dated long distance for about a year before she decided to make the move. I didn't ask her to, but one night she said, "I want to wake up next to you, not my phone." She moved into my condo in Capitol Hill. 3 years into the relationship at that point, and honestly, those were some of the best months of my life. I'd wake up, make us coffee, she'd play music while getting ready. We'd take weekend drives to the coast, spend lazy Sundays reading, and she always made sure we had at least one night a week where screens were banned, and we just cooked and talked. We traveled, Mexico City, Florence, a hiking trip in Patagonia that nearly killed us both, but gave us stories we still laughed about. We had parties, dinner with friends, game nights. Alice got along with everyone. My coworkers adored her. My parents called her a keeper the first time they met her. And through all of it, we never really fought. Not in the dramatic, throwaway sense. We had disagreements, sure, what couple doesn't? But we always talked it out. Always. She supported me through the chaos of launching my own startup. That first year was brutal, sleepless nights, constant stress, but she never made me feel guilty for being busy. She'd bring me food when I forgot to eat, drag me outside when I needed air, reminded me to be human. When the startup finally landed funding and I signed our Series A paperwork, she was the first person I called. There was this night, a random Tuesday, maybe 6 months after she'd moved in. We were sitting on the couch watching some old Miyazaki film, and I looked over and realized I couldn't imagine my life without her. Not in some grand Hollywood way, just in the quiet, real way you feel when your heart recognizes home. That's how it all began. With a pie. With laughter in a kitchen and a second slice I didn't even want, but ended up needing more than I realized. Looking back, it felt like the start of something that might actually last forever. About 6 months ago, I started noticing little shifts in Alice's behavior, subtle at first, like when she suddenly put a password on her phone. That may not sound like a big deal to some people, but we had always been open about that kind of thing. I never went through her messages, and she never went through mine, but we also never had anything to hide. If I needed to use her phone to check a recipe or send a quick text, it was never an issue. Then one day, I picked it up to use the calculator and was met with a lock screen. When I asked about it, she said, almost too casually, "Oh, I just added it for security. There's been some spam lately." It was said in a way that discouraged follow-up questions. A few days later, I noticed she started taking phone calls in the other room. Again, not the kind of thing I'd normally read too much into. But the pattern was consistent. Calls would come in late at night, or just as we were sitting down to eat, and she'd step out with a forced smile and say, "Just work stuff. I'll be quick." The calls were never quick, and she always came back looking a little tense. I asked her once if everything was okay at work, and she said things were getting a bit complicated with one of her freelance clients, some branding contract that turned into a mess, but she'd figure it out. I wanted to believe her. I really did. Then there was the issue with money. Not large withdrawals or anything dramatic, just small, unexplained purchases, shifts in her habits. She stopped showing me her Etsy orders or little design supplies she used to get excited about. When I'd ask about something new, like the expensive sunglasses she suddenly had or a new bag, she'd brush it off. It was on sale, or, "I've had this for a while, you just didn't notice." But I always noticed. Alice had a particular style and a very specific approach to budgeting, something we talked about often in the early days when we were syncing up our finances for travel or big expenses. Lately, though, she'd started dodging any conversation that involved numbers. What really started eating at me was the way she flipped the script and began showing an unusual level of interest in my finances. At first, I thought it was sweet. She'd ask how my 401k was doing or whether the new round of funding for my startup came through. But then it became more persistent. She asked about how much I was putting into my Roth IRA, what kind of returns I was getting on my Vanguard index funds, even pressed me for details on a small crypto wallet I barely touched anymore. It wasn't curious partner questions. It was detailed, almost probing, like she was trying to get a full inventory of everything I had. One evening, while I was going over quarterly reports on my laptop, she sat next to me on the couch with a glass of wine and asked how much money I'd saved since the company landed Series B funding. I remember pausing, looking over at her, and saying something like, "I'm not sure off the top of my head. Why?" She smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Just curious. It's smart to have a plan, you know." It wasn't the question itself. It was the way she asked. Detached, like she wasn't asking for us, like she was building a profile. From then on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Her laughter still filled the apartment, and she still kissed me on the cheek when I brought her coffee in the morning, but there was a distance I couldn't name. A quiet recalibration in the way she looked at me, like I had become something she needed to evaluate rather than someone she loved without question. The worst part was the way she made me doubt myself. She was still kind, still affectionate in the ways that mattered on the surface, but underneath there was this current of secrecy, and I couldn't prove anything. I didn't want to be the paranoid boyfriend who accused his partner of something just because she started locking her phone and asking a few too many questions about mutual funds. But every night, lying in bed next to her while she scrolled through her screen with the brightness dimmed and the phone tilted slightly away from me, I felt that slow, sick tightening in my chest, like something was slipping, and I didn't know how to hold on to it without seeming like I was imagining things. It was a rainy Saturday morning when Alice first mentioned the candle business. We were having breakfast, just the two of us at the dining table, her favorite linen napkins folded neatly beside our plates, my laptop open to a spreadsheet I had been working on. She reached across the table, placed her hand on mine, and said with this sudden burst of excitement, "I've been thinking about something big, our future, actually." I looked up, expecting something like a travel plan or maybe a new project she wanted help with, but instead, she launched into this elaborate pitch about starting a luxury candle brand. She called it her dream, something she'd apparently been researching for months. The brand, she said, would be focused on emotional wellness and sensory therapy, using custom essential oil blends and hand-poured wax in imported ceramic jars. The way she described it sounded polished, rehearsed even, like she had memorized a deck from a startup incubator. She talked about brand story, packaging aesthetics, influencer outreach, even the emotional tone of the copywriting. It was the most animated I had seen her in weeks. She kept calling it our future, kept using the words we and us, but it was very clearly her project. My only role, it seemed, was to fund it. She was asking for $60,000 in initial investment. Not a loan, not a small contribution, an investment. She had already picked out the branding agency she wanted to work with in San Francisco, identified a high-end supplier in Quebec for the wax blend, and even made a mood board for Instagram posts. She said she needed the money fast to lock in early vendor discounts and lease a small studio in West Hollywood. I didn't know what to say. 60 grand wasn't pocket change, even for me. I could afford it, technically, but that wasn't the point. What threw me was the timing. Just weeks before, she had started pulling away, emotionally, physically, even logistically. Passwords on her phone calls in other rooms, avoiding questions about money while suddenly showing a near forensic level of interest in my finances. And now here she was, pitching me a boutique candle business like it was the final piece of our shared future. When I asked her why she hadn't mentioned it earlier, she said, "I wanted to wait until it felt real." She framed it like a surprise, like some grand gesture of ambition and love. But the more she talked, the more it felt like a transaction. Every concern I raised, about the risk, about the timeline, about the market saturation in the luxury candle space, she shut down with practiced optimism. "That's just fear talking," she said at one point. "I thought you of all people would understand what it means to take a leap." What really unsettled me was how quickly she pivoted from romance to business. It wasn't that she had a dream. It was that it surfaced right as our relationship started to feel more like a transaction. I remembered her sudden curiosity about my investment accounts, her questions about stock vesting schedules and liquid savings, all under the guise of building a future together. Now, it felt like those conversations were never really about us. They were reconnaissance. I didn't accuse her of anything. I just listened, asked careful questions, and tried to stay neutral, but inside I was unraveling. Because no matter how much I wanted to believe in her, I couldn't ignore the pattern. Her growing distance, the secretiveness, the curated pitch, the sense that she'd been preparing for this moment not with me, but for me, to fund her escape into something else. That night, while she was in the shower, I opened my own notes app and wrote down everything I remembered from the conversation. Numbers, dates, vendors, everything. Not because I planned to expose her or anything dramatic like that, but because for the first time in 5 years, I didn't trust her. And that scared me more than the money ever could. The first time Joan brought it up, it was over dinner at our place. Alice had invited her mother to stay for the weekend, saying it would be good bonding time before the wedding. I wasn't thrilled, but I agreed, mostly for Alice's sake. Joan arrived Friday evening with 2 overstuffed suitcases and a handbag that probably cost more than my first car. She swept into our home like it was hers, immediately commenting on the lighting in the foyer and the outdated backsplash in the kitchen. That night, over roast chicken and a bottle of Pinot Noir I'd been saving, she turned to me, smiled too sweetly, and asked, "So, Jason, when are you going to put Alice on the deed?" I nearly choked on my wine. I tried to laugh it off, made some light joke about how we weren't even married yet, but she didn't budge. She just kept smiling that tight, artificial smile and said, "Well, responsible men prepare for the future. Marriage is a partnership, after all. You do plan on sharing everything, don't you?" I glanced at Alice, expecting her to defuse the moment, but she didn't say anything. She just kept cutting her food like she didn't hear a word of it. That weekend turned into a slow-pressure campaign. Joan followed me around the house, making little remarks about the size of the closet space, how unbalanced it was that Alice had to use the smaller vanity in the master bath, how any mother would be concerned if her daughter didn't have legal security in a shared home. She brought it up again over breakfast, casually asking whether I had already started drafting the paperwork. "It would mean so much to Alice," she said, as though I were the one withholding affection. Then came the deeper dives into my finances. At first, she'd ask innocent-sounding questions, how my company was doing, whether I was still investing in real estate, what kind of return I was seeing on my index funds. I answered vaguely, trying to be polite, but she kept pushing. "You know, when men don't talk about their money, it usually means they don't have much," she said once, while organizing the guest bathroom cabinet without asking, "or that they're not ready for real responsibility." That word kept coming up. Responsibility. She used it like a weapon. A responsible man puts his wife on the house deed. A responsible man talks openly about income. A responsible man doesn't make his fiancée feel like a tenant in her own home. I'd never once made Alice feel like that. At least I didn't think I had. But Joan repeated it so often I started questioning myself. When I finally asked Alice, privately, gently, if she felt that way, she hesitated. Not long, just a beat, but it was enough. Then she said, "I just think it would show how serious you are. You know, that this is ours." I asked her what had changed, why this suddenly mattered so much, and she said it was about trust. That word cut deeper than any of Joan's digs. Joan stayed 4 days. 4 days of invasive questions, subtle digs, and strategic silences. Every conversation turned back to the deed, to the house, to the future she insisted Alice deserved. The pressure wasn't direct like a demand, it was worse. It was woven into every interaction, every comment, every sidelong glance over coffee. By the time she left, I felt like I'd been through an emotional cross-examination. The place didn't even feel like my home anymore. It felt like I had become a character in a plan someone else had written, and every move I made was now under scrutiny. For the first time since Alice moved in, I didn't feel like we were building a life together. I felt like I was being measured, evaluated, and maneuvered. And no matter how much I loved her, I couldn't ignore the quiet shift happening behind my back. The way her silence let her mother's voice speak louder than it should have. It was a Wednesday night when she said she had another investor dinner. That was how she always phrased it. Vague, professional, and just distant enough to make questioning it feel controlling. I had heard that line before, more than once over the past month, and each time it came with the same details. She'd be out late, it was too boring to bring me along. And no, she couldn't tell me exactly who she was meeting because these things are delicate. At first, I tried to respect her space. I told myself that if I trusted her, I didn't need to know every name or every conversation. But something in my gut had been grinding for weeks, and that night it finally tipped over. She left around 6 in the evening, wearing a dress I hadn't seen her in since our anniversary. Black, fitted, expensive looking. Her makeup was a little heavier than usual, perfume applied with purpose. I asked her where the dinner was happening, and she gave me a name, some modern Mediterranean place in Belltown I'd been to once for a work event. That was all I needed. I waited 20 minutes after she left, then grabbed my jacket and drove over. I parked across the street and sat in the car, engine off, lights down, heart hammering like I was doing something illegal. I told myself I just needed to see for myself, confirm it was nothing, and go home. But when I saw her through the tall front windows, seated at a corner table with some man I didn't recognize, that self-reassurance collapsed instantly. They were tucked into a booth near the window, 2 glasses of wine already on the table, and she was smiling in a way that I hadn't seen in months. Not her polite, dinner party smile. Not the one she gave Joan when Joan went off about responsible men. This was softer, slower, full of that warmth she used to give me when we were tangled up in our own little world. Her hands moved as she talked, and twice I saw her touch her hair the way she always did when she was trying to hold someone's attention. He leaned in close, listening, nodding, and at one point she laughed, head tilted back just slightly, her hand grazing his forearm across the table. I couldn't hear a single word, but I didn't need to. Everything about their body language told a story I didn't want to read. The space between them was too small for a business meeting. The way her eyes followed his mouth when he talked, the way she rested her chin on her hand and kept her shoulders turned toward him, it didn't look like a pitch or a financial negotiation. It looked like a date. Still, I didn't have proof of anything. They didn't kiss, they didn't hold hands, and maybe it was just her way of being charming. Maybe this guy really was just an investor with an expensive taste in ambience. But none of that mattered, not really. Because standing there, half hidden behind my windshield, I realized I didn't believe her anymore. She had left that night with a carefully rehearsed explanation, one I now saw as a script. The flirtation, the secrecy, the sudden business ambition that perfectly overlapped with her withdrawal from me. None of it felt like coincidence. And I hated how easily she had played both roles, the devoted partner and the entrepreneur chasing a dream. Watching her at that table, it hit me that I didn't know who she was performing for anymore. Him, me, herself, or maybe all three. I sat there until they finished dessert. She leaned in again, and he laughed. They didn't leave together, but the damage was done. I drove home on autopilot, numb, replaying every conversation we'd had in the past 6 months like puzzle pieces I'd ignored. No hard proof, no confrontation, just a gut full of dread and a heart that felt like it had stepped off a ledge and was waiting to hit the ground. The email came late in the afternoon, right as I was finishing a call with a client. I remember the moment vividly because I was in the middle of writing a follow-up note when the notification popped up on the corner of my screen. Forwarded message from Elisa Weston, via Weston and Green Law Group. I clicked on it without thinking, expecting maybe some logistical wedding detail, a venue contract, something routine. What I got instead made my stomach twist. Attached to the email was a PDF titled Prenuptial Agreement, Draft for Review. I opened it, thinking maybe it was something standard, protecting individual assets, defining separate property, that sort of thing. But the deeper I read, the more surreal it became. The document wasn't just unreasonable, it was insulting. It outlined, in rigid legalese, that any and all earnings, assets, and investments acquired during the marriage would belong solely to Alice. Not shared, not equitably divided. Hers. Every stock option, every line of code I wrote, every dollar that touched my account after the wedding date would be categorized as her personal property. Then came the section on business contributions. I was required, not requested, required, to provide ongoing financial support for her luxury candle venture. The language was specific. I would commit a minimum of $60,000 as startup capital, followed by annual injections if deemed necessary by her and her financial advisor. No clause about repayment, no protections for me as an investor. Just an obligation, framed as a shared commitment to entrepreneurial growth. What sent it over the edge was the phrasing under what they called domestic cooperation and fiduciary partnership. According to this section, Any refusal to fund the business or provide financial support when requested would constitute a violation of marital duties, subject to financial penalties in the event of divorce. There it was, in plain language. If I didn't bankroll her dream, I would be in breach of the marriage itself. I must have read the document 3 times, searching for the part where it became a joke or a placeholder. But there was no smiley face. No, let's discuss. Just a final line saying I had 7 days to respond before the final draft would be prepared for signature. I sat back in my chair, the words blurring on the screen, and I realized I wasn't shocked. I was just exhausted. This wasn't about protecting herself or clarifying expectations. This was pressure disguised as paperwork. Blackmail disguised as legal planning. All the charm, all the warmth she used to wrap me in had been reduced to clauses and percentages. The person I had fallen in love with, who used to talk about building a life, a home, a future, had been replaced by someone who saw the wedding as a business transaction and me as the funding source. I didn't respond that day. I didn't even tell her I got the email. I just closed my laptop, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the floor for what felt like hours. Because now there was no way to tell myself I was overthinking. The manipulation was no longer subtle. It had a letterhead. The dinner was at their favorite restaurant, one of those dimly lit, overpriced places with a wait list and a wine list longer than the actual menu. Joan had picked it, of course. She always insisted that atmosphere influences outcomes, and I knew from the moment we sat down that this wasn't going to be a casual meal. Alice was dressed like she was heading to a board meeting instead of dinner, and Joan wore this cold, expectant expression I'd seen only once before, when she met with our real estate agent and negotiated like she was buying a piece of Manhattan. The small talk didn't last long. We had just gotten through the appetizers when Joan folded her hands neatly in front of her, fixed her eyes on me, and said, "Let's talk about the prenuptial agreement." No lead-up, no softening, just straight to it. Alice reached for my hand across the table and gave me that carefully measured look, the one she used to give me before telling me bad news or asking for something she knew I didn't want to give. "We just want to make sure everything's clear between us before the wedding," she said, her voice soft, calculated. Joan jumped in immediately. "All modern couples do this. It's responsible, sensible. In this economy, protecting your personal contributions is smart business. You run a startup, Jason. You, of all people, should understand that." I stared down at my plate, forcing myself to stay calm, then looked up at both of them. "I read the prenup," I said evenly. "It's not a mutual agreement. It's one-sided. It turns everything I earned during the marriage into Alice's property and locks me into financing a business that I didn't even agree to invest in. That's not protection. That's exploitation." Joan's smile faltered for a moment before returning in a sharper, more rehearsed form. "Jason, you're being dramatic. This is just how things are done now. Men who believe in their wives don't see this as a threat." I kept my eyes on her. "If you believe in equality, why isn't anything split? Why is every clause in her favor?" That's when her tone changed. She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering just enough to make it feel personal. "You know, we've tried to be understanding. But if you're not ready to take this step, maybe you're not ready for marriage at all. I'd hate for this to get out. Publicly. It would be a shame if people started to wonder what kind of man backs out of a commitment because he doesn't want to share." Alice squeezed my hand harder at that, like she was trying to keep me grounded or maybe trying to pressure me with subtlety. "Don't you believe in us?" she whispered. "This isn't about money. This is about security. About showing that we're building something together." I pulled my hand away, slowly, and let it fall to my lap. "If you believed in us," I said, keeping my voice steady, "you wouldn't need to threaten me. You wouldn't need a legal contract that says I have to pay for your life while giving up my own." Alice's eyes welled up, but I didn't know anymore whether it was real or just another move in the game she and Joan had clearly been planning for months. Joan let out a short breath, like she was finally tired of playing nice. "Fine," she said, reaching for her purse. "If you won't sign it, there's no wedding. And I'll make sure everyone knows why." The waiter came by at that moment, asking if we wanted dessert. Nobody answered him. I pushed back my chair and stood up. "Then I guess there's no wedding," I said quietly. Joan didn't even flinch. Alice just stared at me, like she was waiting for me to come back to the table. But I didn't. I walked out without another word, into the cold Seattle air, my heart pounding, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from the realization that I had just walked away from something I had once believed was real, and now finally saw for what it was. The message came the next morning. No phone call, no knock on the door, not even a face-to-face conversation after nearly 6 years together. Just a text. It popped up on my phone while I was standing in the kitchen, pouring coffee into a mug I realized she had picked out months ago during a weekend trip to Portland. The notification read, "I can't do this anymore. I've thought about it a lot. We're not aligned on our future. I'm calling off the wedding. Please respect my decision and don't try to contact me further. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of everything we'd been through. I stared at the screen for a while, then set the mug down without drinking from it. The silence in the apartment was so thick it felt like a second presence. After the initial shock wore off, I felt something else, anger. Not because the wedding was canceled. At that point, I had already seen enough to know it wasn't going to end in anything healthy. But the way she ended it, the cowardice of doing it through a text message, and the sheer audacity after everything I had already paid for, venues, deposits, catering, suits, floral arrangements, even the ridiculous swan eye sculpture her mother insisted on, it lit a fire in me. I sat down and totaled it all up. Every invoice, every confirmation email, every line item from the wedding planner spreadsheets. $36,000. That was what I had spent out of pocket, not counting the time or emotional labor. I didn't expect her to pay half, not anymore. But I also wasn't going to walk away from the financial wreckage like it was the price of learning a hard lesson. I replied to her message with a single line. I'll be pursuing legal reimbursement for the $36,000 in wedding expenses I covered. You'll be hearing from my attorney. 3 days later, her lawyer emailed me. The tone was as polished and condescending as you'd expect from someone who likely spent most of their time handling celebrity divorces and asset shields. The offer was $9,000. As a gesture of goodwill, they said, and to avoid unnecessary escalation. I didn't even hesitate. I wrote back through my lawyer and rejected it outright. If Alice wanted to play businesswoman and treat a relationship like a contract, then I would meet her on the same terms. We filed a formal claim to recover the full amount, complete with receipts, timelines, and communications documenting the entire planning process, right down to the non-refundable deposit on the reception band she had insisted we book early to be safe. The legal back and forth started shortly after. Her team tried to delay things, threw out claims that the expenses were voluntarily incurred, argued that some costs were joint decisions, and implied that by not signing the prenup, I had undermined the entire process. They even had the nerve to suggest that emotional stress on Alice's part justified the wedding's cancellation, as if that somehow voided the contracts I had signed in good faith. But I didn't back down. For once, I didn't second-guess myself. I had every document, every receipt, every text from her approving details and asking for upgrades and making last-minute changes. I wasn't chasing revenge. I just wasn't going to let someone walk away from this like it had all been my burden to carry. The case dragged out for months, and every court date, every negotiation session, stripped away what little good memories I had left of her. I used to think of Alice as the woman who brought a pie to a party and changed my life. Now I saw her through redlined PDFs and attorney briefings, a person who had turned our relationship into a balance sheet. Eventually, it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about principle, about drawing a line and saying, I won't let you rewrite this story without my side being told. I stood my ground, and I would keep standing. She showed up on a Tuesday, completely unannounced. I heard the knock around noon, just as I was about to sit down for a Zoom call. When I opened the door and saw her standing there, no makeup, red around the eyes, holding one of the mugs she had left behind, I didn't say anything at first. I just stepped aside and let her in, mostly out of habit more than kindness. She sat down on the edge of the couch like it was still hers, like she could just slide back into the space without acknowledging what had happened. She looked around like she was stepping into a dream she had once had and couldn't quite remember. Then she looked at me with this practiced vulnerability I had seen her use before on strangers, waiters, Joan when she wanted something. Only this time it was aimed directly at me. Jason, she started, her voice catching in that way that sounds almost too perfect. I got the subpoena. I don't understand why you're doing this. I never meant to hurt you. This whole thing got blown out of proportion. You know how my mom is. I was just trying to keep the peace. She reached for my hand like it would still be there waiting, but I didn't move. I kept my arms crossed and my expression still. She stared at me for a second, waiting for me to crack, but I didn't. Then she sighed, shook her head a little, and leaned back like the act was starting to weigh on her. I mean, do you really want to drag us through this? She asked, the softness starting to fade around the edges. We were happy. You know we were. I just got caught up trying to build something for myself, and Joan pushed me, and I didn't know how to say no to her. You of all people should understand that. You've had your startup. You've had support. I never asked you for anything you couldn't give. I almost laughed at that. Instead, I said, you asked me to sign away everything. And when I didn't, you ended it over text. That was when it shifted. Something in her face hardened, like a curtain dropping. The tears dried up instantly, like they had never been there. She sat forward now, elbows on her knees, and looked at me with a flat expression that made my skin crawl. Well, Maybe if you weren't so busy playing the noble victim, you'd realize you're not as irreplaceable as you think. Her voice was calm, cutting. My investor. Yes, that investor, the one you followed me to spy on, is offering me better things than you ever could. He believes in me. He's not afraid to take risks. I said nothing, but I could feel my jaw clench. She kept going. You're good at what you do, sure, but let's be honest, Jason, you're not exactly breaking ground. There are thousands of guys like you. Tech bros with moderate success and inflated egos. You think you're so smart because you cashed out at the right time and built a pretty portfolio, but that doesn't make you special. You got lucky. I didn't recognize the person in front of me. I don't think I had for a long time, but now there was no more pretending. Her voice was sharper now, her hands no longer trembling. She wasn't trying to win me back anymore. She was trying to make sure she stayed ahead. If you want to go to court, fine. But I hope you're ready for the blowback. I still talk to people in your circle. I still have ties through my family, people who matter. You really think this is going to help your reputation? Word gets around, especially in your industry. All it takes is one suggestion that you're difficult, vindictive, uncooperative. I stood up slowly and walked to the door. She didn't stop talking. You think I'm the villain? You'll see what happens when you make enemies out of people who know how to play the game. I opened the door and said one word. Out. She didn't move at first. Then she stood, adjusted her coat like she hadn't just peeled off the last layer of her disguise, and walked past me. She paused in the doorway and said, almost wistfully, you could have had something real. You chose to blow it up. I closed the door without replying and locked it behind her. She hadn't just taken off the mask. She had thrown it at my feet and dared me to say I didn't already know what was underneath. The breakthrough came unexpectedly on a cold Friday morning, nearly 6 months after the whole thing began unraveling. I was sitting in my attorney's office going over yet another set of statements and legal drafts when his phone buzzed. He excused himself, stepped into the hallway, and came back in a few minutes later with an expression I hadn't seen on him since the first day we met. Something between shock and amusement. They're folding, he said. Full compensation. $36,000. No conditions. I stared at him for a second, thinking it was a joke. But he slid the signed agreement across the desk, and there it was. Her lawyer, under pressure from the court, had finally accepted full liability for the wedding expenses. No payment plan, no arbitration. Just a lump sum check and a signed settlement. It should have felt like a win. I'd fought tooth and nail for that number, and it wasn't even about the money anymore. It was about what it represented. The acknowledgement that I hadn't imagined it, that I wasn't the one who wrecked everything. But what I didn't know then was that something far bigger had just detonated behind the scenes. That same day, I got a call from someone I never expected to hear from again. Frank, Alice's father. I hadn't spoken to him since the early days of the engagement. He'd always been quiet during family events, the kind of man who let Joan dominate the conversation. You could tell he wasn't made for the kind of social maneuvering his wife thrived on. But he had always been decent to me in a quiet, distant way. When I picked up, I expected anger or some last-ditch plea for silence. But instead, his voice was calm, tired, and different. Jason, he said, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't know what to say to that. He went on before I could answer. I read the court filings, he said. I asked her for the full documents. Not the summaries. The whole thing. I saw everything. The prenup language, the payment clauses, what Joan and Alice were trying to pull. He paused, and I heard him take a breath like he was trying to swallow something bitter. I knew Joan was controlling. I didn't know she was capable of this. And I didn't want to believe Alice could be either. He said it quietly, but with a clarity I hadn't heard from anyone in that family. Then came the part that really hit me. I filed for divorce this morning, he said. After 30 years. I leaned back in my chair, stunned. She tried to do to you what she did to me, he continued. Early in our marriage, she pressured me into signing over our first home. Made it seem like it was just easier for taxes, cleaner for refinancing. A few years later, when things got rocky, she held it over me like a weapon. Told me if I left, I'd walk away with nothing. And she meant it. So I stayed. For decades. And now I see that she coached Alice to do the same thing to you. He wasn't crying. He didn't raise his voice. He just laid it out like a man who had finally stopped pretending. We talked for a few more minutes. He didn't ask me to forgive Alice. He didn't try to justify what she did. He just wanted me to know the truth. That this pattern didn't start with me. That it had been passed down, quietly and precisely, like a playbook kept in a drawer for emergencies. Before he hung up, he said, I should have stepped in sooner. I see that now. But I won't be silent anymore. Whatever happens next, just know this. I'm not on their side. After that call, I sat alone in my apartment for a long time. The check arrived by courier that afternoon, but I didn't open the envelope right away. The money didn't matter as much anymore. Not compared to what that conversation had given me. It was clarity. Finality. Not just from a legal battle or a broken engagement, but from the lingering question of whether any of it had been real. Now I knew. The mask hadn't just slipped. It had been passed down, generation to generation. And finally, someone else had chosen to take it off. A week after the final paperwork was signed and the check had cleared, I booked a one-way ticket to Thailand. I didn't tell anyone except my business partner and my lawyer. I didn't want a send-off or some dramatic farewell dinner. I just packed a backpack, shut down my apartment for a few months, and left. I landed in Bangkok in the middle of the night, sticky heat hitting me the second I stepped off the plane. I spent the first few days just walking, taking tuk-tuks through winding alleys, eating street food off plastic tables with crooked legs, and watching people live lives that had absolutely nothing to do with mine. It was exactly what I needed: distance. From the legal mess, from the wedding that never happened, from the woman I thought I was going to marry, from myself, even. I didn't plan an itinerary. I just moved with the days. Some mornings I woke up early and hiked through the jungle outside Chiang Mai. Other times I didn't leave the hotel room until noon, drinking strong coffee on a balcony overlooking motorbikes and wandering dogs. I met travelers, locals, monks, drunks, and people who didn't care what startup I used to run or how much money I had in the bank. Somewhere between the slow ferry rides and temple visits, the silence started making room for something else. It wasn't peace exactly. Not at first. It was just the quiet recognition of what I had been ignoring for so long. The way I had felt Alice drifting and convinced myself I was just imagining it. The way I had let Joan bulldoze over boundaries and told myself it wasn't worth the argument. The way I had swallowed my instincts every time they warned me something was off, because I didn't want to be that guy, the one who doubted the person he loved. But sitting on the beach in Krabi one afternoon, watching the tide slide in like it had all the time in the world, it finally hit me. I had known. On some level, deep down, I had always known. I just didn't trust myself enough to act on it. That was the real betrayal, not just Alice's lies or Joan's manipulation, but the slow erosion of my own voice. The one that used to be so clear. The one I had stopped listening to. By the time I left Thailand 3 months later, I wasn't healed. That kind of hurt doesn't just vanish. But I wasn't broken either. I had bruises, sure. Scars too. But I had walked away. I had stood up. I had said no when it mattered. And now, I knew I could do it again if I had to. That's what stayed with me more than anything. Not the courtroom win. Not the check. Not even Frank's divorce. Just the quiet certainty that no matter what happens, I'll be okay. Because I know how to survive. Because I already did. I was back in Seattle for less than 2 weeks when the messages started coming in. Screenshots. Links. Little snippets forwarded by friends from Facebook groups I hadn't checked in years. Some local gossip thread about weddings gone wrong. A few comments at first. Then full posts. Apparently, Alice's investor, the same guy I had seen her with at that restaurant, the same man she used to threaten my career, had quietly backed out once the settlement became public record. Word got around that she had no claim to any money, that she had been dropped from her own project the minute it stopped looking profitable. He stopped returning her calls. She showed up at one of his networking events, and he wouldn't even make eye contact. Her new business never launched. The Instagram page for the candle brand vanished overnight. The LLC she had registered in California dissolved a few weeks later. There was no public statement. Just silence. Joan didn't fare much better. Once Frank filed for divorce, the curtain dropped fast. Friends she used to lunch with weekly stopped returning her calls. She lost her position on 2 local boards, and word got out that her own husband had cited financial manipulation as a reason for separation. Her social circle shrank by the day, and last I heard, she'd quietly moved into a condo outside the city. Someone said she started posting vague motivational quotes about rebuilding and overcoming betrayal, but everyone knew what really happened. My friends? They stood by me. Every single one. Some of them said they saw it coming but didn't know how to bring it up. Others just told me they were proud I stood my ground. A few even shared the story in private groups, wedding forums, community pages, even LinkedIn, of all places. I never tried to control the narrative, but the truth had its own weight, and it moved. Alice's name came up often. Not in a vindictive way, just as a warning. As a lesson. Her reputation didn't just take a hit. It collapsed. I know she lost clients. I know some people publicly distanced themselves. And I didn't have to do a thing to make it happen. It's strange, watching someone who once meant everything to you become a cautionary tale. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't post anything. I just watched it all unfold quietly, knowing that truth always finds a way out eventually. So that's the whole story. From the pie at a party to courtrooms and candle schemes. I lived it, and I came out the other side. Now I'm curious. What would you have done if you were in my place? Have you ever been pressured into something that didn't feel right, but everyone around you tried to convince you it was normal? How would you handle it if someone you trusted tried to rewrite your life like a contract? I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments. How would you have handled this mess?